Ron Paul is not going to be your next president. So why are millions of young people hanging on every word from the 76-year-old Texas congressman?
I think the federal war on drugs is a total failure. I think the Patriot Act is unpatriotic because it undermines our liberty. I don't remember voting on a declaration of war.
And why is the GOP so afraid of him?
Allow the people to make their decisions and not get the government involved.
Tonight, Ron Paul, one-on-one, no holds barred.
I'm willing to challenge any of these gentlemen up here to a 25-mile bike ride any time of the day in the heat of Texas.
How he's already changing the face of the Republican Party.
If you have an irate, tireless minority, you do very well in the caucus stage.
Ron Paul answers my questions and your questions from Twitter tonight. The Piers Morgan interview starts now. Good evening. Tonight, the Piers Morgan interview comes to you from Las Vegas on the eve of the Nevada caucuses. I'm at Coy at Planet Hollywood to talk to candidate Ron Paul. He's running a distant fourth here in Nevada, but his influence on young people is far greater than that. His supporters are making him a force to be reckoned with in the Republican Party. And tonight, his formula for keeping America great. That, and a little later, I'll have a supersized only in America. But right now, Ron Paul. Dr. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Nice
now,
to be with
this
you.
will sound like shameless name-dropping, but the last time I dined in this restaurant was with Sylvester Stallone, and the parallel to me is clear. You are the Rocky Balboa of this campaign. How do you feel about that analogy?
I have no idea how to respond to that. I hope that's very positive. It sounds like it could be positive.
Well, I guess what I mean is Americans love an underdog, and you remain an underdog despite this continual, extraordinary support, particularly with the young people. But people still perceive you as an underdog. Do you believe, like Rocky Balboa, that you could surprise everybody and actually win this race? Do you genuinely believe you could become the nominee?
Yeah, obviously so. And I think the record of this campaign, you know, the Republican campaign these last almost 12 months now, shows you that a lot of the candidates are coming and going. You know, they come in, they peak out, and all of a sudden they're gone. And we did have 9. We're down to 4 right now. The one thing characteristic of our campaign is its steady growth. And I saw a little clip the other day on the internet that says, once you become a Ron Paul supporter, you remain a Ron Paul supporter.
Well, that's true. And also, once you have a Ron Paul principle, your supporters say, you stick to that principle. And that is certainly a great plus, I think. When you look at someone like Mitt Romney, everybody knows he changes his mind about lots of issues. I suppose what I would say to you about that is it can be a stick to beat you with, in the sense that if you never change your mind about anything, is that in itself healthy?
Time and history helps change your views. I've changed and modified my views on what I think about the death penalty. Mm-hmm. So it's not overly rigid, but I see it as a refinement and growth in developing a philosophy that is a defense of liberty. Liberty, the concept of liberty has been around for, you know, bits and pieces for thousands of years. And, of course, we've had a grand experiment here. And I'm motivated by the fact that I'd hate to see it lost, and I'd like to refine it, pick up the pieces where we left off a while ago, and actually improve upon what we had in the past.
Now, you are the oldest candidate, and you have been, even when there were 9 candidates, and yet the one that many say has the most energy, and you have the biggest youth following. What do you put this down to? A, where do you get all this energy from?
Well, you know, I don't know exactly, you know, where does our health come from? There's a lot of things. Mental health is important.
Do you work out? Do you have a regime on the campaign?
Yes, and it gets interrupted sometime in the campaign. I can't quite do it, but historically, you know, for 30 or 40 years, as long as I can remember, I've had a pretty strict regime, and it involves a lot of exercise, and it also eating habits are very important.
So what do you do, exercise-wise? When you have time?
Okay, when I have time, I would get up in the morning, and I want to get outside. I'm sort of, outside gives me relaxation, so I don't want to ride an exercise cycle inside. I ride a bike, and I walk. But in the morning, I like to walk between 3 and 4 miles. It takes me about an hour or so to do that. And that sort of clears my head and loosens me up. And good health habits, I think, can prevent usage of a lot of medication. So I strive for that, unfortunately. But I think my parents might have had a little bit to do with good health.
Good
they
genes,
lived at old age. So.
What about diet? What do you do for eating and drinking? Do you have any strict regime with that?
Not overly strict. I'm not fanatic, but I do watch the white things, the white sugars and all. And although I do eat meat, I think fish is better. So, but it's not overly radical, you know. But I think fresh vegetables are good. So most of it is probably more common sense than anything I learned in medical school.
You look good on it. Is this part of the reason you think that the youth are energized by you? They look upon you as a great role model, but also they like the fact that you are this guy who sticks to his principles.
Oh, I think that is it, and I think sometimes then they will translate that in, well, he sticks to his principles about health habits, but no, I think it's the principles of liberty that are so inviting to young people. I think their minds are more open. I don't think their minds have been cluttered. I don't think they've been forced to accept things and accept the status quo, and besides, we live in an era today where the failure of government programs is so blatant, and although I've been doing this for a long time, and we have had a lot of interest in the last 5 to 10 years, it really came to life once the financial crisis, which many of us who have been involved in Austrian economics predicted would come, and it sort of confirmed it, and people are very uneasy about the future, whether it's here or in Europe, and of course we're all interconnected now with global trade and global banking. So I think that has, energized the people because I've been talking differently and warning about these things. And
does it help also that you were a child of the Great Depression? You know, you grew up through that depression, you came out the other end, and you saw what it took, I think, to do that. I was fascinated to read the sheer volume of jobs that you did when you were a young man. I mean, you did all sorts of stuff. You worked with your father on the dairy, but you did countless jobs. You worked very, very hard. Do you see that kind of hard work ethic now in America? And if the answer is no, is that one of the fundamental problems, that work ethic has evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think that's a big issue. People ask me about how my parents might have had influence on politics. Well, they were conservative Republicans, but they were more Republicans than anything else. But I think where they contributed a lot to my thinking was it was a work ethic. Depression and World War II. Matter of fact, the Depression didn't end until after World War II because I remember World War II better than the Depression, and actually things got worse because there was rationing and there were no new cars and all. So the work ethic was very, very important, and I think that had a large impact on me. At the same time, I worked that into a philosophy, but I think, and I talk a lot about it at my speeches, especially on the college campuses, of not depending on the government. They're not there. They're bankrupt. They try to give everybody a free house. And now they don't have jobs and they don't have their houses. So therefore, you have to assume responsibility for yourself.
But how far do you take that? Because although I agree with you to a certain degree, I think I take issue when it comes to something like healthcare, where you have quite provocative views here. I mean, your belief basically is that if you can't afford the insurance for Medicare or whatever it may be, then you've got to fend for yourself somehow or get your local community to bail you out. Am I misrepresenting you, or is that basically how you feel?
Yeah, but it's a lot more compassionate than the way, it might sound.
Is it, though?
Yeah, well, really, because if you see the extent of total socialism, it's not very compassionate. People end up with no care at all. I mean, what happened at the end of the Soviet system? Everybody had free care, but there was no Soviet system. They were totally bankrupt because they had an empire that failed. And today, I was in medicine when we had no government, and I don't remember the problems as badly as I remember the problems now.
But what about as we have in Britain, the basic right to health care for every citizen? What is wrong with that as a principle, an ambition to aspire to?
Well, I think the basic principle is wrong in that you don't have a right to somebody else's life or money. You have a right to your life, and you have a right to your liberty. You have a right to keep what you earn, but you don't have a right to take food from somebody else. And you say, well, I'm not going to take it. The government's going to take the food. You don't have a right to somebody else's house. Oh, yes, but the government will get the house for me. So we who believe in the freedom philosophy believe that you can't use violence to get what you want, but you can't use the government to use violence and force.
But what if you don't have the ability to actually get your own health care. You have no means to do that. What do the people who Mitt Romney was dismissive of the other day, and we'll come to that, what do those people do? Absolutely the most vulnerable parts of society. What do they do?
Well,
under your presidency, what would they do to get health care?
Well, you have to understand the difference between an interventionist economy and a socialist economy. If you really want to produce the best medical care and the best prosperity, the largest middle class, you have to do it through freedom. If you do it through redistribution of wealth, you actually reduce the availability.
Let's take a little break. I want to come back and talk to you more about the economy, also about how you keep America great through tough times like this, and what you think of today's jobless figures, which, whichever way you look at it, are pretty good news for Barack Obama.
You want big cuts. Ron Paul's been screaming it for years. Budget crisis? No problem. Cut $1 trillion year one. That's trillion with a T. Department of Education? Gone. Interior, Energy, HUD, Commerce? Gone. Later, bureaucrats.
Recent campaign ad from Ron Paul. It's interesting, this, because I follow what you say about how you get out of tough times. And it's probably completely opposite to how Barack Obama's doing it. And yet today, we saw jobless figures which are the best since he became president. Do you give him credit for that? Do you think he's doing a good job in reducing the jobless figures? Or how would you summarize your feelings?
I wouldn't give him too much credit. Of course, everybody should be pleased that there are more jobs now than there were a month ago, but they're pretty puny to what we should be doing. But if you look at those figures and dissect them out, they're not all that glamorous, because during that last month, 1.2 million people dropped out of the workforce. So if you get 200,000 new jobs and 1.2 dropped out, you still lost 1 million jobs. So if you take that into consideration, you can't turn these people into non-people. You can't fudge the figures, and that's what politicians do.
I understand.
Wait, let me try to finish that. If you do that, actually, the unemployment rate is 11%, not 8.5. It went up rather than gone down, if you count these people.
Isn't there a problem here, though, that if all the Republicans keep dumping on what are apparently good figures, then the momentum, the positivity that America needs to get itself out of recession gets stymied a bit? I mean, I'm going to read you a quote here, which I thought was classic.
Well, can I answer that?
Well, let me just read you this quote. This is from Jeb Hensarling, who's a Republican representative. He said, "Today is an indication of another failure of his president's policies. 36 months in a row of 8% plus unemployment," which is a ludicrous way of spinning it. How can you say this is another example of a president getting things wrong on a day when actually the official figures, whichever way you dress them up, are positive? Isn't the better thing, the more, I suppose, the more credible position for Republicans to say, I am encouraged by this, but he should have gone further?
To me, it's more important that you admit the truth. So if I'm speaking the truth, so we might have to compare figures, but let's assume for a second that I'm speaking the truth and the 200,000 new jobs was a net benefit. But what I'm saying is we quit counting people. We disavowed them. So if I'm speaking the truth, the most important thing is we know the truth, not as public. Matter of fact, you'll probably have me a hard time. You probably haven't heard me in a speech. I do talk about the president a little bit, mainly on attack on civil liberties and maybe not doing enough about the wars. So I'm not in that same people that say, well, the president didn't do enough. It's all the president's fault, because it isn't. He hasn't done anything to come in my direction of going back to a market economy or looking at the balancing the budget. Nobody, Republicans or Democrats, don't want to cut anything.
What about Mitt Romney's comment about he's not concerned about the poor? Let's just play this, and then I'll get your reaction.
I'm in this race because I care about Americans. I'm not concerned about the very poor. We have a safety net there. If it needs a repair, I'll fix it. It was a misstatement. I misspoke. I've said something that is similar to that, but quite acceptable for a long time. And, you know, when you do, I don't know how many thousands of interviews, now and then you may get it wrong. And I misspoke.
I mean, he says now it's a misstatement, but he didn't say that immediately. And it just sounded awful, that, didn't it? For somebody aiming to be president to talk about the poor in that way seemed callous at best.
The way I sort this out, I don't have probably any agreements with Mitt on policies. Foreign policy, monetary policy, spending policy, bailout policy. But, you know, I think it was a big issue because of politics, because of the opposition, the demagoguing, the media jumping on this. And actually, I think I ended up probably defending him more than he defended himself, because I don't believe for a minute that if Mitt Romney was sitting here, that if he released everything in his heart, he says, you know what, the truth is, I really don't care about poor people.
No, but
I don't believe that.
But what he did say unequivocally is that they wouldn't be a priority, and I found that extraordinary. If I was president, which I'll never be because I'm British, the poor would be my absolute priority.
Okay.
Would they be yours?
If that is your number one priority, if you listen to what I've been talking about and understood free market economics, you would say the most important thing you can do is give them a sound currency, limited government, free markets, contract rights, don't bail out anybody, no privileged classes, and that's when the poor would get the benefits. That's when the jobs would come. But this whole fallacy of saying that we have to... See, I'm concerned about the poor more than anybody, or as much as anybody, but I don't think robbing one group and giving more money to the poor and saying, well, you can have your house, just pay the bills, but he can't do it. So it's a failed policy.
Yeah, but when you have
good intention, but the good intentions don't solve our problem.
When you have someone like Warren Buffett, one of the richest, most successful men in history, begging to be taxed more, publicly saying, tax me, give the money to those who don't have it. What is wrong with that?
And, well, let them pay. Remember going around, there was
What is wrong with having a tax system which just taxes people like him more?
It destroys the economy if you just...
He says it doesn't. And
well, let him pay. Why doesn't he send more money to the Treasury?
There is little evidence that raising taxation for the very rich ever destroys an economy. It doesn't.
Well, that I disagree with.
Historically, it hasn't.
That I disagree with, because government, what are they going to do with the money? Are they going to subsidize the housing industry again and have that thing blow up in the face? Are they going to start another war? That's why they need the money.
Yeah, the problem with the housing industry wasn't that poor people got housing. It was that greedy bankers and financial institutions brought in the subprime mortgage scams, which preyed on people who didn't understand the system. But that's what happened.
But where would the speculation come from if you didn't have easy credit? Where did the money come from?
Well,
if it had come from savings, they wouldn't have done it.
I agree with personal responsibility. A lot of the middle classes that people are rushing to support, I think, overmaxed their credit cards, spent money they didn't have, and are trying to absolve themselves, in many cases, from personal responsibility. But I come back to this. When Mitt Romney said what he said about, I'm not concerned with the poor, I really felt offended for everybody in America. I was like, you've got to have a president. You've got to have a president who prioritises the poor, haven't you?
Okay. Now, if I'd have been confronted with that, the answer would have been different. But the answer would have been different than your answer. You would want more government and more spending. I would have said, that is my deep concern. If you are a true humanitarian, if you care about the poor people, and if you care about not shrinking the middle class, like it's going on right now, we're getting more poor and the shrinking of the middle class, you cannot do it without looking at the monetary policy. If you don't do anything else, exclude everything else, but you just depreciate the currency, the middle class gets wiped out. If you're on the receiving end, the banks and the corporations, the military-industrial complex, they get tremendous benefit. The wealth is automatically transferred from the middle class. The poor get poorer, and the wealthy get wealthier. And then when the bailouts come, they even benefit more, and the bad debt, which should have been liquidated, is dumped on the people.
The flip side to the bailout argument is that when you look at the car industry, Barack Obama did bail out the car industry, and now they're doing very well. So bailouts can work. Indisputably.
Well, you're making an assumption it wouldn't have worked with honest bailouts. It's not an honest bailout.
Well, you don't know. It's chicken and the egg, isn't it? But the point is...
No, it isn't. If you'd had an honest bailout, the people who own those bonds would have been protected. But he turned the ownership over to the unions. So that is not fair. He used force to transfer. He was wrong to break the contracts. Governments are there to enforce contracts, not to adjust the contracts for the benefit of their political constituency.
Even if it works?
Oh, especially if it works. I mean, if a criminal robs a bank and it works, you don't justify the robbing of the bank.
Let's take a break. Come back and talk foreign policy, and specifically the threat of war with Iran. Back now, my special guest, Ron Paul. Let me ask you this. You've lived through many American military conflicts in your lifetime, since the early part of last century. How many of them do you believe were justified?
Well, justified plus legal.
Well, I think people assume you're a pacifist.
I
I don't get the feeling you are a pacifist.
No, I'm not a pacifist.
I think you believe in military action where it is legitimate. But how many do you think of the major conflicts have been legitimate?
Well, from a strict constitutional viewpoint, I don't want to fight any wars that aren't declared. So that means since World War II, nothing has been justified because we didn't go through the proper process. But when you look back...
Did you support the conflict in Afghanistan?
I did, but that said to go after only those individuals responsible for 9/11, not to go into nation building, not going in, into Iraq.
It was war, wasn't it?
To go after Al-Qaeda, it was going after criminals. As a matter of fact, at the time, what I did was...
Was it constitutional?
Well, yes, to a degree, because it was limited. But what I introduced was a resolution to clarify this. Don't turn it into an excuse to go into country and occupy countries and take over countries and go into nation building. I said, look to our history about the letter of marque and reprisal. When you're attacked, say at Pearl Harbor, in a declared war, that's certainly legitimate. Even though we had a declaration of war in World War I, it was a constitutional war, but it was a very foolish adventure.
What is the ideological difference between being attacked in Pearl Harbor and being attacked at the World Trade Center? I mean, if you are
But a country didn't attack. I mean, a bunch of thugs attacked us, not a country. So there's a big difference. There were probably the people, I imagine, and there weren't even 100 people that knew 9/11 was coming. Maybe there were 50, maybe there were 40 for all we know. So it was a band of thugs that had a grievance with us, and they were trying to get our attention. So that's entirely different than...
Have you modified your opinion of what the motivation was? And the reason I ask, you got a lot of flack at the time, although a lot of support as well, for suggesting that the main motivation for the attacks was revenge for what had been going on in Iraq. And I'm sure a lot of it was. But you also said that you didn't believe it was an anti-West sentiment, an anti-riches, an anti-capitalism. I'm not sure that's true, is it? I mean,